All right, this brings us to our last type of other equations. These are rational equations, but when we're done with them, they will be quadratics. So, for example, if we had x over 3 minus 9 over x is equal to 2. We already know how to solve rational equations, so we're going to go about that in the same way. Okay? So our least common denominator, this is factored, so the least common denominator is the multiplication of the 2. So to do that, I need to multiply this one by 3, this one by 3, and this one by x, and this one by x. So now our least common denominator, writing it the left-hand side as one great big equation. By multiplying by x, we get an x squared term there, and now minus 27. And as soon as we have that, we can get rid of the rational equation by multiplying through by our least common denominator, which will lead to these canceling. And then we'll just have the x squared minus 27 is equal to 6x. 2 times 3 is 6. Okay. And so here it is. Here's the quadratic that it resulted, and we just have to solve that. So x squared minus 6x minus 27 equals 0. And this will factor into x minus 9, x plus 3. So it's either that x minus 9 equals 0 or x plus 3 equals 0. So that x is equal to 9 or x is equal to negative 3. Again, we have two solutions, but we do have to check back. We need to make sure what our domain restrictions are here. In our original equation, we have x over 3 minus 9 over x equals 2. Okay. So we have to exclude any values of x that will make the denominator go to 0. Okay. Now 3 is a constant number, so no value of x will make this go to 0. However, from here, we see that if x equals 0, then we're in trouble. Okay, we get an undefined. So x cannot equal 0. Okay, these are our excluded values. And so when we're done with these equations, we have to double check our solutions to make sure that they're not one of the excluded values. In this case, they're not. So these are both good solutions. Let's do another. 4 plus 1 over x plus 1 over x squared, minus 1 over x squared is equal to 0. In this case, our least common denominator is x squared. From here we have an x, and here we have two x's, so the most amount of times x occurs is 2 times, right? So that will be our least common denominator. And remember, we'll think about this as over 1. So this one needs to be multiplied by x squared, here x squared, here just by x, here by x. This one's already over x squared, so we don't need to do anything about that. And now our least common denominator is x squared. This is equal to 0. So from here we have 4x squared. And from here we have plus x. And then minus 1 equals 0. Now we want to get rid of that rational equation. So we can do that by multiplying by x squared. That's over 1. Okay. Then our x squareds will cancel. And we have 4x squared plus x minus 1. And 0 times anything is 0. So here's our quadratic. The leading coefficient is not 1. So let's try the AC method. 4 times 1 is 4. Okay. And we need to add that up to positive 1. And the factors of 4 are 1 and 4 and 2 and 2. So there's no way for us to get to a positive 1. So this isn't going to factor. This leading coefficient isn't 1, so I'm going to not complete the square. I think this is a good candidate for quadratic equation. So in this case, A is equal to 4, B is equal to 1, and C, we have to be careful with this negative here, is negative 1. So the quadratic equation says that x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, that entire thing over 2a. So here we go. Negative from the formula, 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 squared minus 4 times a, which is 4, times c, which is negative 1, all over 2 times a, which is 4. And now we'll simplify. So this is negative 1 plus or minus 1 squared is 1. A negative and then a negative become positive. 4 times 4 is 16 times 1 is 16 all over 8, which is negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 17 over 8. So these are our two solutions. We can double check with the restricted values or excluded values. We see that the only value that will make the denominator go to 0 is if x is equal to 0, so x cannot equal 0. These are clearly not equal to 0. So these are our two solutions. Let's try another. Let's say we have negative 4x over x minus 1 plus 4 over x plus 1, and that's equal to negative 8 over x squared minus 1. So let's determine what our least common denominator is. The first thing we have to do is factor, and we see that this factors into x plus 1, x minus 1. So our least common denominator, here's an x plus 1, so we need 1, or I'm sorry, x minus 1, here's an x plus 1, they both need to be represented, and the maximum times they occur in any fraction is just to the first power, so we're okay there. While we're at it then, let's put our excluded values down, and if x minus 1 cannot equal 0, and x plus 1 cannot equal 0. So we see x cannot equal 1, and x cannot equal negative 1. Okay. These are excluded values. Alright, now let's continue working on this. Now that we know that our least common denominator is x minus 1, x plus 1, And since this is factored, we may as well leave it. So here, in the first part, I have the x minus 1, so that needs to get multiplied by the x plus 1, and so does up top. So our first term will be this. Plus, and then here we have the x plus 1, so we need the x minus 1. So I've written as one great big fraction, and now we can clear those fractions. Let's multiply through by our least common denominator. Remember, this is like over 1. Now here's the x minus 1's will cancel, and the x plus 1's, and the same on this side as well. So all we have left is that negative 4x times the x minus 1, or plus 1, sorry, plus 4 times x minus 1. And the only thing we have left on the right-hand side is negative 8. And now the fractions are gone, the rational equations are gone, so let's just solve these. We'll distribute this through. So negative 4x squared minus 4x, and distribute this 4 through, plus 4x minus 4 equals negative 8. When we combine like terms, those will go to 0. So we have minus 4x squared minus 4 equals minus 8. So let's add 4 to both sides. Minus 4x squared equals minus 4. We can divide through by negative 4. So x squared will be equal to positive 1. So that when we take the square root, x will be equal to plus or minus 1. So these are what we would think our solution would be. However, we need to come back and check our excluded values. And we see the values that we have to exclude are exactly what we've come up with, plus or minus 1. So in fact, neither of these solutions are good, and there is no solution to this equation. Okay, let's try one more. Okay, so let's say we had to solve 3x plus 2 over x minus 2 plus 1 over x is equal to negative 2 x squared minus 2x. So let's state our excluded value. Well, first let's factor. Okay. This is factored and this is factored. I can factor out an x from here, and this becomes x times the quantity x minus 2. So our excluded values, from here we see that if x is equal to 2, we'd get 2 minus 2, which is 0, so we cannot have that. And from here, if x equals 0, we'll get undefined. And then both of these lead to 0 and 2 as well. So these are our excluded values. Let's look for our least common denominator. From here, we see that the least common denominator is the multiplication of these two, which will get us to this, which is this denominator. So I'm preparing to write this as one big fraction. And since this is factored, we may as well keep that. So in this case, I already have the x minus 2. So I need to multiply by an x. So we'll have to be careful about this. Using parentheses, that's 3x plus 2 times x plus 1 times, and here we need an x minus 2. Once we have the common denominator, let's multiply through by that to clear the fractions. Over 1, over 1. X's, x minus 2's, x's, x minus 2's. So we just have the numerators left. Which is equal to negative 2. Alright. Now let's distribute. Now we can distribute, we're just distributing from the other side, so that's okay. We'll get 3x squared plus 2x. And 1 times anything is just itself. We don't even have to change the sign. If this was a subtraction, we would. And here's our resulting quadratic, so let's try and get this simplified. So this is 3x squared. 2x's plus x is plus 3x. And I'd like it equal to 0, so let's add 2 to both sides, which will make them both of these become 0. And let's try and factor this. So in this case, there's a greatest common factor of a 3x in both terms, leaving behind an x plus 1. Don't forget about the 1 because we need to distribute it through. Equals 0. Now it's fully factored and we can use the zero product property. So it's either that 3x is equal to 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. So dividing by 3, we have x is equal to 0 or x is equal to negative 1. And these are our two possible solutions. We want to double check these to make sure that they're not one of the excluded values. And 0 is an excluded value, so we will throw this solution out. We only have 1 in this case, where x is equal to negative 1. Okay, so that's the whole section about other types of equations that can occur that you should be able to solve at this point in time. Get started on your homework and send me an email if you have a question.